Hello, you're very welcome to this talk on bereavement from Milford Care Centre. My name is Estelle and I'm a member of the bereavement team. It may be helpful for you to listen to this presentation with someone else for support, or if that's not possible, perhaps arrange to talk to someone after on the phone about it. You might like to listen to the whole talk together or a little section, pause it and come back at another time. The talk is going to be delivered in two parts. The first section will describe the experience of grief after the death of someone close, and the second section will give information on coping with bereavement generally, and then specifically as a result of COVID, and I'll talk about the resources and support available. We often underestimate the full impact that grief can have on us until we're bereaved, but understanding something about grief can hopefully offer you some reassurance that what you're going through is normal. Not that it's easy, but a normal part of grief. We all know that these are exceptional times we're living through, but we also know that each person has their own loss and grief to deal with. So whether you're bereaved in recent months, in the last year or two or longer, we acknowledge that your grief is real and valid. We hope that this talk will be helpful for a number of people, for those who are grieving, but also those around them, their friends and acquaintances. It may also be useful for people who meet the bereaved in the course of their work and provide informal support. To let you know what's going to be covered in part 1, I'm going to talk about what grief is, children's grief and how they react, grief as a process, and then to answer some frequently asked questions. Part 2, coping with bereavement, supporting a grieving person, grieving as a result of COVID, resources and information. There are many different types of loss. It is said that loss is a normal part of life. Grief, however, very specifically refers to our response to the death of someone close. It doesn't have to be a relative that has died, but any person that you had a close relationship with. The language of loss talks about the death of loved ones, but we know that as human beings, our relationships are not perfect. This means that we also grieve people who were a part of our lives, but perhaps the relationship was difficult. People do say this, that you have to be strong when you're grieving, but being strong will mean different things to different people. And at times it seems that we're expected just to dust ourselves down after a death, to get on with everyday life and to try to get back to normal. But that's just not possible. In Milford, this is how we see grief. People say, that time's a great healer, but time alone does not heal. We need to give it attention in order to heal. So rather than saying to people to stay strong or to be strong, this is what we believe, that you have to work through and complete grief by facing feelings openly and honestly, expressing and releasing those feelings fully, tolerating and accepting our feelings for however long it takes for that wound to heal. But we accept that it's not easy. Grief is never easy. For most of us, it is a big order. It takes courage to grieve. It takes courage to feel that pain, to face the unfamiliar, and grieving in a society that mistakenly values restraint, where we risk the rejection of others by being open and different. Most people grieve privately. Bereaved people often tell us that they have a face that they show to the outside world, and it gives the impression that they're okay, but on the inside they feel truly broken. That's the real face of grief. So we may know of people who are bereaved before us. We can have the impression that they got on fine, they got on with less distress than we're feeling, and we compare ourselves to those people. And we ask, well, what am I doing wrong? I should be coping better. If we're thinking that, we're being very unfair on ourselves. These are some thoughts about grief. It is described as hard work. It can make you feel physically and emotionally drained. We all have ways of coping with difficult times in our lives, and when we're bereaved, we may rely on the ways we coped before, but not all losses are the same, and we may be at a different time in our lives, so we might need to think about what's going to help us now with this loss. It can be difficult to control grief. The more we try to push it down, the more it wants to come out, or it seems to come out of nowhere when we least expect it. Something small, such as a song on the radio, can bring on another pang of grief. We don't advise that you make any major decisions at a time when you're feeling vulnerable. Grief is very different for each person. Even brothers or sisters grieving the death of a parent, individuals will grieve the same person in different ways. Grief has no timetable. It generally takes longer than we think, though. It's important for us to do things at our own pace, but people often want us to be better than we are, to be further on. And to remember that we do have a natural inclination to recover and heal from grief. Grief can have an impact on every aspect of our lives and on ourselves, something we're not always prepared for. In the next section, I will describe normal grief reactions, and this is divided into how grief presents itself in our emotions, how we feel physically, in our minds, and in our behaviour. You may identify with some of these experiences more than others. And when I say these are normal reactions, it's to give you a sense of what bereaved people say. It's certainly not to suggest that you will go through all of these feelings. Sadness is one of the most dominant emotions we feel when we're bereaved. We can feel very down and upset, and the sadness can persist for some time. People feel that sadness comes in waves, and the emotion can feel very raw. Gradually the intensity lessens, but another wave can come later on, perhaps on a special day or with a particular memory. We may feel anger for many reasons. I'm going to talk about this separately. Blame can feature in grief for us also, perhaps blaming a person or an institution for the death. We often feel guilty when we're grieving, feeling as if we didn't do enough. The thing with hindsight is that we tend to be very hard on ourselves. We look at the things we didn't do or say, rather than at the things we were able to do and able to say. We may focus on the time period leading up to the person's death more so, and this can overshadow perhaps many years of care and attention we gave the person. But as we work through these difficult memories, by reflecting on them ourselves, or perhaps talking them through with someone else, we can hopefully get a different perspective and gradually feel less guilty. Grief is very unsettling. It can feel as if your world has been turned upside down and life can feel very uncertain. This can lead us to feeling worried or anxious, even about how we're going to cope, especially if the deceased was a main support in our lives. Or we may feel empty or lost. Sometimes it's as if we don't feel anything. We may feel very vulnerable and helpless and in a situation that we just didn't choose to be in. It's important to note that even where we had some time to prepare for a death, when we knew it was going to happen, we can still feel a sense of shock when that day actually comes. People often remark to us that you can never be fully prepared for a death. We may yearn for the person who has died. And going back to what I mentioned earlier about grieving difficult relationships, we may have a sense of being released after a death of a person that perhaps caused us difficulty or heartache, or was abusive or neglectful. Survival guilt refers to the sense a bereaved person may have that it should have been them that died instead, particularly if there is a sense that the deceased had a lot more to live for. We may feel relieved for different reasons, perhaps relief that the person's suffering has ended, or we may feel numb. Sometimes when bad things happen in our lives, our instinct is to protect those we love, so we can become overprotective to others in the hope that no harm will come to them. Some people are concerned that they're depressed, that they feel so down and so low. Others who've had depression previously worry that they will become depressed again. But grief and depression are different. If you have any concerns about depression, I would advise you to discuss this with your GP. We may be fearful that something else is going to happen, and people often think of that saying, bad thing happens in threes, or something similar. Having regrets is very normal. Again, looking back, perhaps harshly on ourselves, wishing we had done things differently. I hope you can see this diagram okay. This is the anger iceberg, and I think it's a really helpful way for us to understand anger. Anger can be what's on the surface, but there may be other emotions underlying it, such as guilt, worry, stress, feeling anxious, nervous, or lonely. It can be helpful for us to be aware of this, either for myself or another person if they are angry. These are some of the ways people tell us they feel physically when they're grieving. Hollowness in the stomach, tightness in the chest or throat, oversensitivity to noise, and a sense of depersonalization. Nothing seems real, and sometimes people say it's kind of like being in a bubble. Some other physical feelings then associated with grieving. Some people who've been caring for a person before their death can just feel worn out and run down and can themselves become unwell with recurrent colds or infections, for example. It can be worrying for us if we recognise or start to feel some of the symptoms associated with the illness the person died from, maybe a particular pain. If concerns persist, it's always a good idea to have things checked out with your GP. Grief can affect our thought patterns, but it's not a feature of grief that is acknowledged very much. Denial is often mentioned, but denial is a coping mechanism. It's almost as if we pretend to ourselves that the person hasn't died. It can be a healthy coping mechanism. It can stop us from feeling overwhelmed, particularly in the earlier weeks of grief. But as time goes on, we rely less and less on denial as we slowly come to terms with what has happened. Sometimes we really struggle with the belief that the person has died. We may ask ourselves, is it really true at all? Sometimes people tell us that they feel confused or muddled, that they have become very forgetful or can't concentrate on anything like they used to, such as reading a book. This can cause a lot of concern, but when we think of all that is going through our minds after a death, trying to make sense of things, then it's no wonder we're affected in this way. These problems usually get better. Being preoccupied with the deceased is thinking of them all the time. It can seem that they're on your mind every single moment. You may feel they are close to you, perhaps in particular places. Some people have suicidal thoughts associated with a wish to be reunited with the person who's died, but they don't normally act on these thoughts. If, however, any person is concerned about suicidal thoughts, it's essential to talk to your GP, the Samaritans or Pieta House immediately. Sometimes we think we see the person walking down the street or hear them talking to us, maybe hear their car arriving at the house. These sensations can feel very real. Grief can also cause a general sense of disorganisation in our lives as we try to make some attempt to get back on our feet on the ground. It's part of the unsettling nature of bereavement. You may recognise some of these behaviours for yourself, particularly sleep disturbance, which is very common. For some people, they have difficulty getting to sleep in the first place, and for others, they can get to sleep, but then wake up after a few hours and then they're awake for the night. It can take some time for your normal sleep pattern to return. Not sleeping makes it much harder to deal with the day ahead. It may be helpful for you to talk to your GP, again, if you have sleep problems, and although you may be reluctant to take medication to help you sleep, it may be advisable in the short term. Appetite disturbance can be undereating or having no appetite at all, or overeating. It is something to be mindful of. Absent-minded behaviour is being in a bit of a daze. Bereavement really impacts on our social interactions with others. We just don't feel like going back to the things that we used to do before, or we may feel that we don't fit in. For example, if our group of friends is made up of couples and our partner dies, we might not feel up to meeting friends, so we say no to an invitation. If we're supporting a bereaved person, it's important to keep the invitation open for when the person does feel able to say yes. We may dream of the person, which can be comforting or upsetting when we wake up and they're still gone. We may avoid things that remind us of them because it's just too painful. These are some other behaviours that can be a feature of bereavement. Maybe keeping busy all the time so we don't have too much time to think. Searching is almost an instinct that we have as we try to make sense of the fact that the person is gone. They must be here somewhere. It's not a conscious decision we make to search for the person, but half expecting to find them in familiar places. Sighing and crying. Sometimes it can feel like the tears will never stop, but they will. We might like to visit places associated with them or treasure their objects. Just to say a little bit then about children and bereavement. How children react to bereavement will very much depend on their age, their stage of development, and whether they've experienced death before. Generally, infants don't have an understanding of what death is, but they may react to the absence of someone in the household or the emotions of others around them. Preschoolers don't understand that death is permanent. They may expect the person who has died to come back, and that can be very upsetting for everybody. Older children start to comprehend that death is final, but also that everyone dies someday, and that can make them worry about others dying too. Children often don't express grief as a result. We may assume that they're getting on fine, but that might not be the case. They grieve in short bursts, so they can be extremely sad, then go back to be their normal happy selves, and go back to being sad again in a short space of time. They can revisit grief at different developmental stages as they grow up, and they're able to make more sense of what has happened. So it's important to realise that children's pattern of grieving is different to that of adults. Children may show none, some, or many of these responses listed here. The emotional responses could include fear, anxiety, confusion, anger, sadness, relief, loneliness, guilt, or isolation. Physical responses could be low energy, interrupted sleep or eating patterns, unexplained aches and pains. In their behaviour, they may lack concentration, they could have memory loss, they could be acting out or aggressive, irritable or regressed behaviour more commonly associated with a younger age, for example bedwetting or sucking their thumb. Children can experience a loss of self-esteem and confidence, or withdrawal from friends and activities, maybe not wanting to go to school, for example. Sometimes children hide their real feelings as they don't want to upset the adults around them. So supporting bereaved children then, just a few thoughts. To be honest, in a gentle way according to their age. To use concrete terms, that the person died, that their body doesn't work anymore, they can't move, breathe or eat. Not to say that they're gone or that they're sleeping. To include children as much as possible in goodbye rituals. To remember it's okay for them to see us grieving, that it's normal to grieve. To respect their decision not to talk, and they may show what's going on for them through their play, and to avail of professional support services if you need that. This is a really helpful website for further information on supporting bereaved children. These are some of the questions that we are often asked in Milford. How long will it last? Well, grief always lasts longer than we expect. In some ways, grief is always there, as we will always miss the person, we'll always remember them. The intensity lessens, but sometimes so slowly that it can seem that we're not healing at all. It's sometimes when we look back that we can see the progress that we've made rather than at the time. But to remember that we don't come through a major loss in weeks or short months. You may ask yourself that, am I going mad? And with all the normal grief reactions that I mentioned earlier, it can feel as if you'll never be the same again, but you will come back to yourself. You won't be exactly the same, but you will start to feel more like your old self gradually. There's definitely no right or wrong way to cope. Everyone has their own way, and you will have yours. If you feel that grief is overwhelming, that you're struggling to cope, then it's a good idea to get help, to reach out to your own support network or professional support. Talking does help. Talking to others who knew the person can give a sense of shared grief and memories. Also, talking to someone neutral can be of benefit, as that person's not going to be upset, they're not grieving. You can also get another perspective on your grief, which is just not available if you keep your grief to yourself. We talk now, as I said, about grief as a process rather than the stages of grief. This is something you may have heard before, but we've moved away from that now. That was one theory, but now we look at it as it doesn't follow a linear pattern, that it's more like a roller coaster. It's often about expressing familiar emotions. Talking about the person, not just about how you're feeling, can be helpful to you. And remembering who they were as a person, maybe sharing happy or not so happy memories. And to remember that grief does not end the relationship that you had with the person. There are definitely different patterns or styles of grieving, and we all respond in our own way. It will be different for each person. It's impossible not to grieve, and people can feel that unresolved grief may surface at another time. It's important to maintain hope that you can come through this experience and find new meaning in life. Just to try to answer this question in another way, if we see the jar as representing a person and grief is represented by the red ball in the centre, the jar on the left is the impact that grief has on us initially, that it almost consumes all of ourselves, with just a little bit of space for the other things that we have to do in life. In the middle jar, we see that we have grown around the grief. It's still there, but we've grown stronger, and there's a little bit more space for life and living. Grief stays with us. The person is always a part of us. In the third jar, we see that we have continued to grow and heal, and that the grief can feel easier to carry, as it's in less proportion to ourselves and our lives. When we're in a dark and a difficult place, it's hard to imagine that we will ever feel different, or better, or more positive. But bereaved people who've come through these times can give us hope that it's possible. When we're trying to cope with bereavement, it's important to remember the power of now. We can't deal with all our grief in one go. It might help to deal with it a few hours at a time, or maybe just an hour at a time. Today is enough to deal with. Try not to think too far ahead. Thank you for listening to the first section of the talk. You might like to listen to the rest of the talk now in part 2, which is recorded separately, or come back to listen to it at another time.